The United States was attacked on September 11th. Our NATO allies, all of you, stood with us. A breathtaking display of friendship that the American people will never, ever, ever forget.
I just want them to pay their bills. We're protecting Europe. They take advantage of us very badly.
President Biden and former President Trump, well, they really could not disagree more about NATO's importance to the United States and how to keep the alliance going. This is leaders from that alliance are here in Washington to celebrate 75 years of cooperation. I want to bring in our political panel, Sabrina Siddiqui and Sam Vinograd. Sabrina is national politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Sam is, of course, a CBS News national security contributor. Sam, I want to talk to you first. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said today that there is a clear path for Ukraine to join NATO. Also, an announcement from the United States, Denmark, and the Netherlands to send F-16s to Ukraine. Break down the importance of both of those.
Sure. So there is both a short-term and longer-term agenda for Ukraine as part of this NATO summit. In the short term, it was critical that allies showed, and they delivered on this major, immediate support for Ukraine in their war against Russia. There were announcements of additional air defense batteries and components from the United States and 4 other allies, which will be delivered to Ukraine in the coming months, as well as these F-16s, which have been held up. So direct military support was announced en route to Ukraine. Over the longer term, there were also really important announcements about Ukraine's, quote, irreversible path to membership in NATO. That's being operationalized as well. The allies announced that there will be a NATO security training assistance mission set up that will help coordinate NATO support for really bringing Ukraine into the fold. So we see both the short-term deliverables and the longer-term deliverables. The problem is major. The elephant in the room is that there's a rush to do all of this because come November, if Mr. Trump does win the election, all bets are off. And Ukraine as a part of NATO, as an irreversible path to NATO, is no longer an absolute certainty. So time is not on Ukraine's side in this respect.
Pick up on that, Sabrina, this idea that new commitments, fresh commitments, and a kind of hurried pace with the prospect of possibly losing the presidency and all of this falling apart, or being slowed significantly down, if not reversed.
That's a big concern among NATO allies who are watching this election very closely. And I think especially as concerns have mounted over President Biden and his viability at the top of the ticket, there's, a real sense of panic among some NATO member countries that you could see a return to a Trump presidency, where we are well aware of former President Trump's skepticism toward NATO more broadly. And of course, his lack of support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. Now, former President Trump hasn't actually offered many details on how he would handle the war differently, but he has opposed sending additional funding to Ukraine, which has, of course, been a key priority of the Biden administration's. And, he said he'd bring the war to an end. But what does that mean? And, there's a lot of concern that he would try and broker some kind of peace deal that would be favorable toward Russian President Vladimir Putin. So I don't think it's by accident that President Biden was really focusing on reaffirming U.S. support for Ukraine in both the short and the long term, as well as making a point to note that NATO member countries are meeting their defense contributions, contrary to what former President Trump has often said, in a bid to really draw contrast with his opponent.
And Sam, isn't it true that when former President Trump says, I'll have this Ukraine-Russia war settled, most European leaders interpret that to mean you're cutting off U.S. aid and giving Ukraine no viable choice other than to capitulate and to surrender at some form or another?
I think the whole world assumes that when Mr. Trump says he'll end the war quickly, that's by placating Vladimir Putin. That has historically been his track record with Russia.
And he's done nothing to publicly disabuse people of making that assumption, which he could.
He hasn't. And ironically, NATO member Hungary, Viktor Orban, and Mr. Trump do have that in common, a very cozy relationship with Vladimir Putin. But what I do think the Biden administration has failed to do and is quite focused on doing is trying to explain NATO's relevance to everyday Americans. Mr. Trump has capitalized on this notion that NATO is for them. It doesn't directly impact the United States. Why are we paying their bills? When, in fact, NATO, and when I was in government, I worked closely with NATO partners on key issues in the counterterrorism space and otherwise. NATO directly impacts U.S. homeland and national security.
Sabrina, I want to talk about this week in terms of not only juggling the NATO summit and the many serious issues there, but this tortured political conversation that persists about the president's viability. And it's not a Republican conversation at all. Republicans aren't even touching it, wisely watching the fracas play out entirely within the Democratic Party. How has that affected the president, and how does it inform the future of Kamala Harris, the vice president?
Well, the fact that we're still talking about this, Major, when tomorrow marks 2 weeks since the debate, is exactly why this has been extremely challenging for President Biden and his reelection campaign. They had hoped to put this issue to rest. You know, I think there are Democrats who felt like the president should have been out, you know, in public more and more forceful in the initial days after the debate in defending his candidacy, his performance. They felt like he was late to reach out to leaders and other Democrats on Capitol Hill who are still openly weighing whether or not he should stay at the top of the ticket, even though President Biden has been very clear that he has no plans to go anywhere. How does it inform Vice President Kamala Harris? Look, she's been one of his most loyal defenders in both public and private since the debate. And I think that, you know, what she has really, you know, said to people behind the scenes, in addition to what she said in public, is that she believes that Biden is best positioned to defeat Trump and that they should try and refocus on the threat that Trump poses to democracy rather than prolonging this conversation that only weakens the Democratic Party because it gives ammunition to Republicans to portray Biden as a weak candidate. But, you know, there are a lot of Democrats who are kind of rallying behind her as the most viable alternative. They think she's a known entity. She could easily inherit his campaign cash, which another candidate wouldn't be able to do because she's already on the ticket. And they just feel like that would be the most seamless path if he were to step aside. But that's the big caveat. And there's just no evidence at this point in time that the president will step aside.
Thinking about this a year ago, Sabrina, isn't it fair to say that the vice president could fairly look at those Democrats now rallying to her and say, where were you a year ago when almost none of you said I was up for the job or capable of carrying out the obligations of vice president, and would never say a public word in my defense when I was being pounded by Republicans relentlessly?
I think there has been a lot of frustration I've heard from, you know, supporters of Vice President Harris who feel like she has, you know, withstood attacks that have been, you know, rooted in racism, misogyny. She is, of course, the first woman, the first black person, and the first of Indian descent to hold the role of vice president. And there was just a lot of scrutiny on her performance in a way that her predecessors have not had to, you know, deal with. And she's really found her voice on reproductive rights. So there is a sense that she's also come into her own in the job. But, you know, it seems like it's too little too late right now. But there's still some Democrats who are calling for some kind of blitz primary. So, you know, right now, I think all bets are off. We really don't know where things are headed. And I think President Biden is just hoping that come next week, the party moves on and unites behind his candidacy. And this is no longer an open-ended discussion.
Never more have the words "stay tuned" been more true than they are now. Sabrina, Sam, thanks so very much.